So we have a recording up. All right. So everybody mind your P's and Q's. We're being formally and officially recorded. And welcome to Satsang. It's a beautiful day and night where you are. And we have about 3 of us from the West Coast of the United States in here. And then the rest of you are from the wonderful and beautiful area of England, London, Great Britain, or whichever version you want me to use. We've got Nana's in the house, which is grandma. So we are blessed, and it's really awesome because I love it when she's in the house. That's awesome. So anyway, so I thought I'd start today. Actually, if everybody can give their thanks to Julian. Yesterday, he asked me a few questions, and I'm actually going to work with those questions a little bit for everybody today. And it kind of a fun set, I thought. And so to start with, let me just start with the story of awareness and consciousness. Now, remember, when I say this, I'm just describing in an intellectual or story way. I'm telling you a story, and the story I'm telling you is about how consciousness and awareness works. So the actual experience of awareness and consciousness is different than my story. So it's only in the experience and the movement that one can then look at and go, oh, that's how that works. And so all that's happening here is that the mind is looking out there and saying, oh, I think that's how it works. So when we're doing this, remember, the stories sometimes they change as we go because there are new things. And that's a little bit of what I was going to tell you. So we start, it's just basic awareness. All we are is pure awareness. And then the problem, it must be, I guess, awareness sometimes must get bored. It must be boring to just simply be aware, So awareness says to itself, well, you know what I need is a sandbox. I need somewhere to play. And so what it does is it creates this thing called consciousness. And what comes with consciousness is a sandbox or a world to play in. That's the next step. And we have fancy words for that sandbox. We use words like manifestation. That's the main one. So whenever I say that fancy word manifestation, that's just the place that we all are hanging in right now, the sandbox of our world. And that sandbox of our world was created, I'm saying, because awareness got bored and decided it needed to get into action. Now, here's the thing about all of that. The only thing that consciousness does on behalf of awareness is to reveal itself to itself. That's all it does. Every moment it's busy revealing itself to itself. Now, here's the thing that you need to kind of tuck into your kind of sense of things. It doesn't matter whether it's in separation or entire unity. Consciousness will work to reveal itself to itself, right? That's what it does. So it's always working to do that. So everything that you and I see in regards to that is that attempt to reveal itself to itself. That's what's actually going on. So a lot of times you and I look out there and we in our stories, we have an opinion about what's good and what's not. I'm gonna mute you down here, buddy. So when we look out there, we have an idea of what's good and what's bad and what's nice and what's not nice. Consciousness does not pay attention to that. In every situation, it is going to go look and reveal itself to itself. It doesn't matter what the story is. It doesn't care. In fact, it creates the stories and then it lives within those stories to reveal itself to itself. It does all of that. So that's what consciousness is doing. Once awareness has launched it into being or into action. Okay. All right. So now with that as a backdrop, I wanted to kind of go into the questions that Julian asked me, and I kind of wanted to walk into it that way. So Julian says, brain pick, please, sir. So there you go, Yasmin. He's trying to pick my brain. You already know where that's going to end up. He says, Is consciousness indifferent to the actions of the beings it inhabits? That's a really great question, isn't it? And the answer to that is no, it's not indifferent, but it's indifferent a lot of times to the stories that we create. So how does that work? Well, think about it. We all think that we cause our own actions, or we're the cause of our own actions, but here's what really happens. Our actions happen, and then immediately as those actions happen, we make up a story about those actions. And that story can be right, or it can be wrong, or it can be anywhere along the spectrum, because consciousness is going to do all of the stories it can. So what happens is that consciousness is living in every one of those stories. If you could imagine, what if you knew that when they said Jaya or when they said Sabrina, that really there was no one called that. That's just a story. And what you really were was consciousness looking through your eyes. So when you think about it that way, consciousness is living every single story that's human. Now here's the next question that Julian asked, and here's the thing that bothers him a little bit. Dr. Hawkins, who is a well-known spiritual teacher, says that even meerkats have a moral code and look out for each other. How come some humans don't seem to have any qualms about the pain and suffering they inflict on their unsuspecting fellow men? Well, to get to that particular answer, and here's the answer I gave him. I'll read you my little answer to him, and then we can. And by the way, as we go along, for everybody who wants to put a question in, feel free. That'll be that. I'll jump into those, but I'm going to work on these first, and then we'll go from there. I said, great question. I suspect meerkats, like most animals, don't intellectually frame their existence, right? So what I'm saying is that animals, they don't have what Ramesh, my mentor, used to call the dubious gift of intellect. So they just simply live their lives. Now, we do know that animals respond. There must be some level of intelligence in there, but depending on what level of animalness you're at, but they don't frame so specifically and so in such a dedicated manner the intellectual piece. We make up a story about everything. So our story, when I talk about it, is the way that we live our lives. So then they look moral as the natural state of being is one of looking out for one another. So within species, there is a natural motivation to look out for one another. And you can see that. Now, of course, other species will hunt down and kill animals. That's what they do. And that's how consciousness works. Evidently, the only way that consciousness can exist is by consuming itself. So it reveals itself to itself, and it also consumes itself. Those are the two. And it doesn't really matter if you're a vegan or not. You're in some way, shape, or form, you are consuming consciousness to continue to be conscious yourself. So that consciousness evidently has as its nature to consume itself. So for humans, the separation story creates a disconnectedness from our own natural sense of taking care of each other. So that's just a feature you see in humans. We think that what we are is an autonomous story, and we think that we're in charge of that story. And because we believe that, we create more separation than you will see among animals who don't engage in that particular story. So the reality is that consciousness doesn't even traffic in that story I just told. It acts through beings, but tends to pay no attention to the story that they are different entities. In other words, so the beings are happening and consciousness, there's two ways to tell the stories. It doesn't pay attention. Our mind always squares it up, as you know, but it doesn't, consciousness doesn't have the need to pay attention to those stories. So that said, the natural affinity within species seems to be a feature, but less prevalent in humans due to their intellect. So, so that's the question. Yeah. So here you go. Julian says Hawkins says that female polar bears protect their cubs, and that equals love. And what I'm saying is that um, that the that natural act of protecting, we then pencil that in to love. That's what we call it, right? So it's our story that says it's love, and on the ground, it's how animals act to each other, right? Now, you all know, I don't know if you know this or not, but I'm a big elephant lover. I don't know why that is. When I was very, very young, I'm going to get to that next, by the way, Julian. But when when I was very, very young, for some reason, I fell in love with elephants. My grandmother, as you can imagine, I was a very active young child. I saw Amir dancing in front of the TV today. And if my guess is, if you had me with my back turned in front of a TV and a diaper on when I was that age, I would have looked a lot like that, because Amir was moving, and the small version of Alan was one that moved as well. And so my grandparents and parents would look for anything that might have me be still for, I don't know, even a moment, because what they did with me was they seemed to chase around after me a lot. And so their concern was always, how do we get this child quiet? And one day my grandmother took me to the San Diego Zoo. That's where I grew up as a very young man, was in San Diego. And as we got to the end, I don't remember this, by the way, I'm telling the story that my grandma told me. And you know how grandmas are. The story might not be exact, but it's grandma's version. And grandma walked me by the elephants, and she noticed immediately that I quieted down. So grandma decided she was going to do a grandma experiment. And she said, well, what if we sit this young crazy boy on a little bench in front of the elephants? And she and I proceeded to sit in front of the elephants, she claims, for 30 minutes. She also claims it was the only time in my young life that I had ever sat anywhere for 30 minutes. So it might not have been 30 minutes, but it was longer than grandma had ever seen me sit. And so that became a custom. Grandma bought a pass to the San Diego Zoo, and we lived nearby, and she would take me there whenever I wanted to go, which was almost every day. And it became an absolute custom that grandma and I would sit in front of the elephants. And when mom and dad and other people would go, grandma would usher the whole family over, and we would all sit in front of the elephants, because that was was my favorite thing. Now, I don't know why, but the elephants just completely captured me. There was something about the elephants. It was soothing. They were solid. They were there. They were really, elephants are just the most amazing things. So I saw a story about the elephants. There's a fellow in a place called Zululand. If anybody knows where Zululand is, there was a fellow that lived there in the late 90s. His name was Lawrence Anthony. And what had happened is that there was an elephant herd, a fairly large one, in Zululand, and it had gone rogue. As you know, elephants live in matriarchal units. So there's always a mom like Sabrina who's large and in charge of the whole elephant herd. And that elephant herd completely organizes around the Sabrina of their herd. That's what they do. And the grandmas who are in the herd are playing grandma, but Sabrina, the mom, is the one who leads the elephants, and everybody gravitates. And so mom had passed. The matriarch of that particular herd had passed, and the new young matriarch, Nana was her name, by the way. So there's a fun one for you. So Nana, she did not really know what to do. She was young, she was inexperienced, and she was very, very uptight about that and having to lead the herd. And so they began to leave their area, and they were marauding across Zululand. And what happened was that the government and all of the politicians were getting really concerned about that, because they were destroying anything in their path. You can imagine, take 100 or 200 elephants and turn them loose. They're going to really mess things up. So as that was happening, it turned out that Lawrence Anthony had thousands of acres that he had turned in to a nature preserve. And they went to Lawrence and they said, we're going to kill these elephants because they're creating all of this havoc, and we will give you an opportunity if you'd like to put them in your nature preserve. And if they'll stay in that preserve, we'll let them live their lives there. And so Lawrence knew that this wasn't a good thing. And in fact, what really irritated Lawrence was that the hunters all knew that this was true. And if they got out of his preserve in the beginning, they were all gathered around the boundaries of his preserve, waiting for an elephant to break out so they could kill the elephant, because elephant hunters like to do that. So what happened was that Lawrence, he didn't really know what to do. He later became known, he got dubbed from the story as the Elephant Whisperer. And so Lawrence would go out and he would, every night as Nana was getting ready to make her break, Lawrence would go out and he would stand at the fence at the boundary, and he would tell Nana about all the bad things that could or would happen to her and her herd if she went across that fence. And every night for several months, he was able to convince Nana that if she calmed down, that nothing bad would happen. Now that's the story, and that's his story, but that's what he did. He actually went out and he told the elephants that story. Now, over time, the elephants figured out, Nana calmed down in an overall way, and Nana figured out that that area was hers, and the elephants started exploring the area, and that became their home, that new nature preserve. And what would happen is, wouldn't be uncommon to see Lawrence out there talking to Nana and the other elephants. They would have their trunks on him, smelling his breath as they do. They love to do that. And so touching him. And so he became very famous in Zululand as the Elephant Whisperer. And so the elephants would live on his thousands of acres. Sometimes they would come to the house. Sometimes they're on the other side of the preserve. And fast forward about 12 years, in 2012, Lawrence had a sudden heart attack and he passed. And of course, his wife was stricken. She was very upset by this. And on the day after that Lawrence died, the entire elephant herd showed up at the house. They had come from the entire opposite end of the preserve, thousands of acres. And so they had spent hours coming from one side of the preserve to the other. And for 3 days, they stood outside the house. Now, you and I would probably call that a wake, but the elephants were grieving. That's the story we tell. We don't know exactly what the elephants were doing, except for that Lawrence, who was one of them, had passed. And elephants, like humans, when someone passes, they gather to do whatever they gather to do. And for 3 days, the elephants stood there, and they day and night, hundreds of these elephants. And if you want to go check out, go look up any video about Lawrence Anthony in Zululand, and you'll get to watch. You can watch Lawrence, you can watch him with the elephants, and you can even watch the video of the elephants as they stood around the house after he had passed. So that's the story of the elephants, and I love the elephants, but there's something in that whole story that you can see that there's a natural way in which elephants protect elephants. And we all call that love. I like to say that it's highly likely that within the animal world, because intellect doesn't stand down or score or write boundaries into place, that elephants by themselves naturally are going to watch out for each other. So that's the story of the animals. Now, the next thing that Julian asks is, he says, when humans are, and I think he put it in here too, he goes, when humans are 0 to 6 years old, they are kind, loving, helpful, trusting, non-judgmental little souls that constantly help and support each other happily. Question 3, how come that 0 to 6 beauty disappears? So I would contend that from 0 to 6 years old, much like our elephants, that humans have a natural sense of sameness. You are I and I am you, and that creates a watching out for each other kind of essence that lives among children. Now, you remember when we did the spiritual MBA, there was a little section I called the bastardization of you. And what that is when, as human beings, we get taught within our intellect what I call the woulds, the coulds, and the shoulds. Now, notice that the woulds and the coulds and the shoulds all depend on one thing. That's what Alan would do, Alan should do, and Alan could do. And that means that this Alan story or Alan character is being taught that he is in charge of his own movement. And so the idea of a separate Alan begins to emerge, right? And that's the story. So the story of humanity is that we are separate, autonomous entities. Now, as we retrace our spiritual steps, we start to see that we actually aren't, that we are actually lived into each moment by consciousness itself, and we create the story that says we're separate. And a lot of us who feel bondage and then are driven into our spiritual journey, that bondage is entirely in our story. We're telling ourselves the story that we're separate when in actuality we aren't. And the whole spiritual journey is moving from believing the story that we're separate to standing in the story that we're not. That's it. So in a certain way, what are we doing? I always tell you, it's a reclaiming or a retracing. It's going back to the beginning when there was no sense of boundaries and no sense of you and I. That is, in essence, the spiritual journey, right? So my answer was the incessant construction of intellect, right? That's what, now remember, what does intellect do? It pulls out, it divides and extracts stuff from all the world around us. That's called cognition. And it constructs it into a story. That's what intellect does. So what is the activity of intellect? It's a separating activity. It's separating one part of existence from another part in order to construct a story. It's intellect in its very nature is separating. So now the mind is a really beautiful thing as a navigator, co-pilot, and support piece. But when it's in charge, since the only thing it knows how to do is separate, it's going to separate. So when you look at the separation of humanity, what you see is consciousness revealing itself to itself in the most possible separate way among individuals who think that they are separate. And love is that sense that there's something else going on that lives underneath. And all love is the natural birthright that we all have, that we know we're not separate. So those two things are always playing against each other, right? So the ego story of separation obfuscates that intellect. What it does is it hides the other piece underneath. So that's why you see all of the ugly things that humans do to each other. There you go, right? It obfuscates the essence of what we are, which is awareness itself. Remember, we started with that boring awareness, completely one thing. All of us, the same thing. There was no difference. So Julian goes on to ask, so as the ego grows stronger, the separation story brings on the self-protecting, self-serving animalness. Yes. And here's my answer. Because here's the fun thing when it comes to kids, the woulds, the coulds, and the shoulds, the bastardization of you. That's why bullying begins to show itself. What is bullying? The natural outcome of separation in its construction is to feel the separation. Bullying, in the way that I put it in my answer to Julian, is kind of like a test drive for the new ego model for this year. So as a child gets into its ego space, it really feels like it's separate. And one of the ways for it to feel its separateness is to bully. Because when you bully someone, you really feel the difference between you and I. So if you find yourself bullying someone else, you might want to say to yourself, oh, wow, I'm exploring the bullying, right? Wow, I didn't know that that's what that's what I'm doing here. That's what consciousness through me is doing. It's trying to see what it looks like when I do the bullying. That's what it's up to. Okay, that's nice. So now Paolo will tell you, because he knows this, he's talked to me a lot about this, that there's an antidote for bullying, which is we have our story of separateness, right? So what do? If you find yourself exploring the bullying, what's the other story that could be at play here? You create a new story. When you create a new story, you also invite consciousness to go explore it. So what's the new story look like when bullying is not the separating activity? What's a story that's not a separating story? And it's only because we know we're not separate that we know we can create a story that's not separating, right? But story by its very nature in the beginning, because of what we're receiving from culture and our society, will always tend to go to the separating piece first, because it has to maintain you as an autonomous actor in your own drama. So that's what happens there. And the antidote? So if Paolo were to find himself bullying, I don't know, the cat. Paolo's bullying the cat. Why not? And Paolo could then say, well, what could another Paolo story with the cat be? So that's a way of working with that, right? So then here's where Julian asked the final question. He said, so as my ego dissolved over time, racism went, judgment went, compassion, understanding arose, and humility arose. After self-realization, the 0 to 6 mode popped back up, that small child when you're 0 to 6. And then he asks, is self-realization the only cure for self-serving, nasty adults? Now, when he asks that, what he's assuming is that all the nasty self-serving adults are going to get on a spiritual path, and they're going to return to that place where they are self-realized. And what self-realized is when 24/7 you are in contact with the notion and the understanding that you are not separate. That's all it is. In between that, you're actually working with that. You're going back and forth. And we call that toggling or free samples. There are ways to refer that. There are times when you're on a spiritual journey, you feel at one with everyone, and there are times when you're struggling. And that's normal. Nothing wrong with that. That's part of the retracing and reclaiming of the spiritual journey. So that's what happens there. So I say, folks do get nicer egoically as they see the direction of the spiritual movement, because they can tell themselves other stories that aren't separating, aren't ugly, and aren't as Julian calls it self-serving and nasty, right? But in the end, we all are seeking for the permanent fix, the place where our birthright of simply not being separate lives. So that was the first set of questions, and I thought it would be fun to go through those. So I'm going to go back, and I'm going to pick up on the comments. Jaya had a very beautiful comment in there, it's a follow-on to the elephant story. So jump in on that if you get a chance. In fact, I'll read it because why not? When my small herd of horses would start acting up, we had a lead mare named Shanti, great name, who was anything but peace, by the way, LOL. We used to say, okay, we're going to have a talk with Shanti. Every time we did, whatever the behavior was, from challenging the electrical fence to picking on the new guy, the talk worked and the behavior stopped. See that belonging, the natural sense of belonging. The horse had it. So, by the way, the elephants in my story were absolutely stepping over all sorts of electrical fences. They put electrical fences in thinking that it stops elephants. And I think everybody kind of knows now that doesn't work. Elephants go where they want to go. That's one of the features of elephants.
The horses go where the grass is.
Exactly. All right. So here's Sabrina's question. What are we really doing when we became parent to a new soul? Why do souls enter into this experience so vulnerable, having to surrender to the two souls? Now, the why is one that would simply be a story that, you know, Sabrina and I would make up. And what we're doing when we're a parent is the same thing that every other species does, Sabrina. As the new ones come in, there's always a parent. If you watch the elephants, I think it's 8 or 10 years that the mother elephant is clearly a parent before the elephant spins off. For humans, they say it's 18. I'm not sure that's a high enough number, although that seems to be the number that we let humans escape as though they're adults. And so what we're really doing is we're living our species. We're human beings, and the new ones come along. We have the natural instinct inside and the natural love inside that we collect them. And then we go about as consciousness, attempting to continue to reveal ourselves to ourselves. Now, what makes children's education so interesting is what happens when you know ahead of time that the process of separation, the process of usually after that 0 to 6 period that Julian talks about, starts to render children into separate entities that are prone to things like bullying, and later those become other things when they're adults. What does it look like when you're aware of that? What does it look like when the teachings that we all embrace as we're in our spiritual journey, what happens when those are delivered in early, right? What does that look like? So my guess is for you, the story is, and I think everybody knows Sabrina works really hard to deliver that kind of thing in. And the Ben Salmi family is a family that embraces a lot of what is the process of being one? What's the process of love? What are all those processes? And so the story in that family is one of, if you will, short-circuiting the period of time that one feels separate and has to act separate and may engage in very separating activities. So that's what I would say as a as an answer to that. So and so why do souls enter into this new experience? So remember, consciousness is constantly revealing itself to itself. How does it do that? It needs to have bodies of sentient beings, as far as we know. I'm not sure that plants and other things, even rocks, aren't sentient. So, but consciousness works through everything that is, and we certainly know it works through humans, and it tends to utilize our intellect to get that to happen. So, so the soul, before it enters, it's not an individual, so it doesn't have a reason that it enters other than consciousness enters it. Consciousness enters every new body that shows up, and then consciousness is taught to be separate, and then consciousness is hell-bent on revealing itself to itself, and will do that in whatever story and form is out there. So that's what it looks like. So those souls are simply consciousness entering the world. Now, remember, whenever we ask why questions, then we make up a story to go there. The stories I make up are a little different than the ones other people make up, because I'm always going to point everybody back to consciousness and to awareness itself. So, Julius, one's name is a baby being repeated, misidentification. Even our language is unhelpful. What do you think? instead of what thoughts are you noticing? Or you could even say what thoughts are being noticed if you want to take the you out. What do you feel instead of what feelings are you noticing or being noticed? Bullying the big monkey, picking on the small ones. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So I have a pointer that I call linguistic imprinting. And because what I'm interested in is what makes the conditioning that makes us feel separate. And if you think about it, language is so that one body mind can talk to another body mind. That's what it's for. So every time if you believe that you are Alan, every time somebody says you or Alan or that, what that does is it further confirms that Alan's a separate thing. You don't notice it. It's kind of insidious. It happens with the rest of everything, but it continues to confirm to you that you are a separate thing. And so when you hear me say that we live a life as if, living a life as if, all that means is that you've got a story that says you're separate. Now you're living your life as if you were separate. And every time someone speaks to you, they're confirming to you that you are by saying you. Now we can't speak without using you and I. And so the secret to what Julian just said is to see that's just a story. And you aren't your story, right? That's not who you are. Your consciousness, your awareness and consciousness itself. And you are living that story. So behind all of that you lives awareness and consciousness, and it's driving that story. And your mind grabs all of what it grabs and says, this is the story, and places it in front of that, and you can't see it. You no longer can see your source. And then you start to know that something wrong, because your intuition knows source and says something wrong here, folks. And the spiritual journey happens, by exactly that path. So is there a consciousness pathway from girlhood to womanhood and from boyhood to manhood? And yeah, there is. I think the ways of wisdom, when we talk about knowledge and wisdom, and one of the reasons I think that question even is relevant, Sabrina, is that in our world today, we're very knowledge, data-based, information-based. That lives in the world of knowledge. And if you look at everything is a separating activity. Give me the piece of information that's different from that piece of information. If you look at our politics today, have you ever seen more separation, right? So separation right now is at its height. In the United States right now, we're hearing people talk about secession, which means one part of the country will leave the other part. So that's a conversation you don't hear a whole bunch or haven't, but it's happening now. No surprise, because the world of data, its job is to separate one thing from another and give you a piece. That's what its job is, right? The pathway from girlhood to womanhood is a flow. And the beauty of story is that for some reason it has an ability to hold the flow. So we've used stories forever, all the wise men from all of the time, right? We've got a special guy here, Winston. Winston is a new friend of mine. Love him dearly. He reminds me of everything that Motown was about in the 60s. And that's about the highest place you can hold in the Allen world. That's a pretty big place to hang. And Winston is involved in making up a game. And when you talk to Winston, he's going to tell you all about that story. And he's a musician. So here's what happens: flow and music, flow and story. So Winston really lives in the wisdom world. He may not know it. He thinks he lives in the information world, and he's going to generate this game, and it's going to be all data driven, and it's going to be introduced that way. But that's not where he's really living. Where he's living is in the world of perfect flow, where one moment never separates it from another. And that's what girlhood to womanhood is that movement with no flow. Now, the beauty of that particular thing is just to recognize and be able to tell the story of non-separation. And that's what the wise ones did in ancient times, from what I can tell. That's my opinion. And And so what's beautiful, as you know, the difference between the boyhood to manhood and the womanhood to girlhood to womanhood is that women are naturally given signals within their own body that tell them that they are moving from girlhood to womanhood. So that natural piece allows for the women. One of the reasons that the women are the great storytellers of our world is because they get to tell the story of this natural movement that they feel inside themselves. That's why when you look back at ancient societies, you're always going to see the council of women and women's stories. So if you ever have a chance to listen to the story of women, listen to it, you're going to find something way different in it because it is so centered in the internal movement of themselves. They simply are doing that. For men, however, there seems to need to be a reason, a story to connect to the rest of everyone. And there used to be a thing that was called initiation, where the young boys would initiate into manhood, and that was how the boys knew that they were making that movement. And a lot of what they did would would be to provide and protect. The male role traditionally was a provide and protect role. And so the boys would be introduced to that activity, and that became their purpose within their herd. Now, what's been lost a lot in our world today, well, both the women's wisdom, because the women no longer congregate in the way that they used to pass that wisdom along, even though they still are physically connected to the flow of that movement. And for men, what has happened is that men have forgotten that their job is to prepare the next round. And the reason they've forgotten that is because we idolize the hero, the climbing of the mountain as an individual. And to do that, we need knowledge and information. We need the ammunition that allows us to climb the mountain. And that has been so embraced and so worshiped that men have forgotten that they're in charge of the next generation. And so they let them handle it themselves. And you can kind of see what's happening there. Now we're bringing that back. We're starting to bring that back. There are guys like Winston out there. We have young Paula, who's a storyteller. I would be reticent if I didn't mention Lachey and Yasmin, who are women facilitators who tell their stories. And all of these people are wisdom people. These are all people that deal in the flow of life itself, and then they attempt to push that flow back into our herd, to reacquaint them with who we really are in terms of that movement. Now that's just our story, and that's what consciousness is doing. And in the meantime, we find our way back to ourself, right? So right now I find that the wisdom for boyhood to manhood is to play the role of grandpa. The grandpa is the one thing that's left in our human construction that still is total. And by the way, Nana, grandma is too, but grandmas are way better than grandpas. We all know that. But grandpa is the place where men are allowed to explore all of their freedom. If I want to cry about an elephant story, I'm a grandpa, I get to do that, right? If I want to cry about a puppy story, I think I've done that here before, I get to do that because I'm a grandpa. But the younger men, remember, don't have that. A lot of times don't feel that they have that. So if there's anything that you want to do to help men move in to that space, give them the permission to wander around in their own wisdom whenever you can. When you look out there and you say, why do some people have more meaningful relationships as men with other people? It isn't that we've left our manhood, but we're indulging in our wisdom. We're indulging in the part that makes us human. And very strong men are also, can be very strongly human. And that's the learning that we're going through. So if you as a man feel less connected than you'd like to feel, then your possibility is to start to engage in wisdom rather than knowledge. What's wisdom? Well, remember when you were a little boy and you hung around with all the old guys and they told their stories? Start doing that. Be one of the old guys that tells your story. Don't tell people how things work. Don't tell people what the score of the last game is. You might tell a story of a game, right? Because there's some great ones to tell. But men who are wise men share their stories. So share your story.
Abuelo,
Yes.
You just said something. It's just amazing. And the word that I would use at this moment is that you're living in my head rent-free. Because I was just thinking, just as you said, I'm thinking how I used to sit at nights, and where I was growing up, there was no electricity. When I was growing up, there was lamp, there was gas lamp, what we light, and I remember we used to sit around the older heads to tell us stories.
Yep.
To tell us stories that would scare us. Stories that we would, you would go to bed and you will think, they used to tell us stories about a thing we used to call rolling calf. And they used to tell us Anansi stories. They used to tell us all kinds of stories. And I was just thinking about that while you were talking.
Yep.
And then you said, I need to tell the stories.
Yeah.
And it's weird.
Yeah, your grandpa. Now listen to that voice, everybody. If that man told a story, now in my little lifetime in Southern California, we all the men would meet in the garage, and if you come into my office, it's built like a garage, and you'd get it right away. This is the place where stories are told, and I sit here every day in the middle of my garage. It's an office, I guess is what we call it, but it looks like a garage. So it's got a cement floor, just like a garage. The beams are showing, right? There's no walls. It's just painted. It's a garage. So your gas lamp and my garage, those are the same things. And that's where, you and I get to live. And so when I listen to you, Winston, I know that's what you're up to. You think you're making a game. I know that's what you think you're doing. But what you're really doing is you're being grandpa to a whole world. So how does your story look like the stories they used to tell you? How does that story put a young boy to bed in a way where he goes, oh, I want to go explore. I'm going to race through my head because, Grandpa Winston told me that story. I know it's in the game, but it's Grandpa Winston's story. That's what this is. And I'm going to roll around inside that because, man, wow. So, yeah. That's how we create. That's how we move from boyhood to manhood. That's what.
I do have a sidekick of mine who I work with, and whenever we want to explain this story to someone, he's always said, "Saint, you tell it. You tell the story.
Yep.
Because the way how you tell it." Yep. Nobody else can tell it like you.
Yep.
And I've always taken back to it like, really? Yep. Are you serious? No, or you just, but eventually I started to know that telling my story, people tend to gravitate to it.
An old man's story feels good, doesn't it? Think about it. When you and I talked to him, do you remember? He died and went to heaven. He had two of us in the room that time. So, and we went back and forth telling stories, and I could just see he was so happy because, he was like you and I were when we were kids. He's a young guy. He's a brilliant. This man is just brilliance. And Paolo was in there with us. Remember, Paolo, you were in the middle of that. And so there we were telling these amazing stories, and there was a couple of old guys and a couple of young guys. And we were doing exactly what I was talking about in the meeting that we had. We were exploring what's it look like to go from boyhood to manhood, and how do we do that? And we were reinstalling that, at least for us. So there you go. All right. I'm going to go on to, let's see. Trayshawn, how can we get better at, in a way, translating what we want to say that all can understand, whilst not feeling as though they are being targeted? Story. So think about it, Trayshawn. If I give you, if something's happening and I give you an instruction, right? I give you a set of instructions, that feels one way. If I give you the formula, that feels another. If I give you a spreadsheet, that feels another. But if I tell you a story, right? So what's the story that you can tell somebody that includes them and you, right? And actually leads them to the point that you would like them to see. And one of the beauties about that, here's something that you can try, Trayshawn, just for kicks. I do this all the time. Sometimes when I'm building a story with somebody and I don't know how to get there, I'll say, here's the story I'm building and here's what I'm trying to tell you. So be vulnerable. Here's what I'm trying to get to. And a lot of times what will happen is they'll jump in and they'll start to help you. I saw the funniest video the other day saying, it's right up this alley, right? This man had parked in the handicap spot, and these two guys come to pull him out of the handicap spot in a tow truck. It turns out that the big guy in the passenger seat was blind, and the guy who was driving had two canes, older fellow, right? And the guy whose car was being picked up was the only car in the lot, but it was in the handicap spot. He comes out of the building and he is literally going crazy that these guys are going to tow his car away. And the older guy says to the younger guy, the guy that's driving, the big guy, he says, "What?" The blind guy says, "What kind of car is it?" And the guy, he tells us, "Oh yeah." He says, "Well, there's a hook up underneath there, and that's where you attach it so that we can tow the car away." And they looked at the guy who's absolutely crazy, and he says, "You know, as you can see, I've got two canes. I have a hard time doing that. And my friend here is blind. He doesn't drive, by the way, but I do the driving." And he says, he says, "Can you help us?" He says, "The hook, the little loop is right under that, front bumper there, front, fender. And if you hook that on, we're going to be able to tow the truck." And what's happening as you're watching this is the guy who's the driver whose truck is being towed away, right? Who's going crazy about it, is now down on his hands and knees looking for the little loop under the fender so he can hook it up to have his own car towed away. Right? Because the guy just told it, "Here's what I'm trying to get done. Look, you're in this spot. We have to tow you away. It's our job. And, I know there's other spaces open, but, we got called. They're very, very stringent about this at this building. We have to do this. And so, but hey, you know what? We're kind of disabled a little bit, but if you can help us, because here's what we got to do to pull your car away." And boom, the man who felt separate all of a sudden didn't feel separate anymore. I don't know if that answers your question, Trayshawn, but think about it that way. How do you tell the story so that somebody can move from a place where they feel separate to where they don't feel separate? And one of the ways is to get them to help you tell the story. I like to use that a lot. All right. So how can males learn to feel more and express despite old wounds? So true. That's why I love our sister cycle. All right. I'm going to go into total opinion here, everybody. So get ready for that. When we're talking about male stuff, all I can do is tell you the story from my place. Male emotion is different than female emotion. And so the best thing, I think, from a female perspective is to say, how can males learn to feel more and express more despite our own wound, despite old wounds, and recognize that when you're saying that, it's not going to look the same as it looks for you. Men will never express themselves or feel things the way that women do. So to me, one of the biggest problems we have sometimes is that women are trying to get men to act like women, and it just doesn't work, right? So men one of the things about emotion for men, when we were in India, we learned about what they called the chakras. And at the very bottom chakra, the first chakra, that's a male dominant chakra. And the second chakra, which is emotion, is a female dominant chakra. So what that means is that men are complementary in the emotional space. They're not as big as women are. So when you're a woman, the physical safety is a big issue, right? So if I invite you to meet me at 3 a.m. in a parking garage, you likely as a woman are going to feel physically threatened, right? When women invite men into the big emotional tent, a lot of times that's akin to inviting a woman to a parking garage at 3 a.m. in the morning. Recognize how big the emotion is in the woman's world, and recognize that most men, they don't hold that emotion. It strikes fear into their heart. So women facilitate the emotion that's there and recognize it likely isn't going to be occupied in as big of a way, right? And likely not going to be described in as big of a way. So the way that males can learn to feel that is to, one, be introduced to the fact that emotion, right, and feelings are completely their birthright, but to also respect that it has to be on their terms. They have no choice. Men are built like men and women are built like women. So it's not like, geez, we have a choice here. There's no choice here. So that would be my answer to that question. And as I say, my story, my observation of just the world at large, and kind of how to deal with men. So there you go. All right, I'm rolling through here, everybody. So here you go. Sabrina says, boys need men, a male pack who hold the space for them as they grow. Thank you so much. Men who do not have a male circle may become disconnected and feel separate. Yeah, and in a way, Sabrina, here's the thing. Men, believe it or not, are more separate anyway. They kind of operate that way. So the container for men, I always say women, when you put them all in a container, it's fabricked. If you watch women together, they like, right? It's like a sponge, boom, right? That's what it looks like. For men, it's more like a, if you've ever seen where they pick balls for the lottery, you notice how all those balls are bouncing around and they're inside a container, and you pick one, there's a number on it, and that's how you win the lottery, right? That's what male cohesion looks like, right? Each of those balls is a separate ball with a number on it, and they're all bouncing around in it. What the old men do is they create the container for the bouncing to happen. So when those boys go into the garage, or Winston went in to hear that story, right? There was that, oh, this is who I'm one of. And then what did we do? We went off and we lived it by ourselves. And then we came back and we reconnected to what we were one of. And then we went and bounced around. I come out into my garage and I write for hours on end, right? So that's what I do. I bounce around like one of those ping pong balls inside of the big clear ball. That's what I do. So that's more what it's like to be in a man's world, right? So the male circle, that's the thing I was saying before, it looks more disconnected than the female version. That's the way it is, but it's entirely connected, right? Because you know who you belong to, but you're given the freedom to bounce around like a ping pong ball. That's the beauty of maleness. All right. Paolo, all right. This afternoon, I was doing some work on the brain with Yasmin, and I thought to myself, if memories are our experiences, are dreams memories that have been jumbled together, or is your dream your calling? Okay, so we're going to talk about dreams for just a second. Paolo, dreams are no different than right now. So what happens is that our body minds record things, and then they extract some and they organize them and construct them into stories. And a lot of times when you dream, that same thing is happening, only the boundaries are different there. So things look entirely different. So it is possibly true that things that don't get to escape during real life escape during your dreams. Not saying that that's not true, but think about the sameness. The thing is, when you wake up from a dream, don't you believe that that dream was real? And then you enter back into this world. And when you enter into this world, you go, oh yeah, that was a dream. It's not real. But while you were in that dream, it was real, right? So a dream is nothing more than the same thing that's happening right now. So, and remember, when you say calling, you and I've had this conversation before, right? You don't need to worry about your calling. Let consciousness just live you. And then when you tell the story, you're going to tell the story about your calling, right? My calling is to talk about stuff like this, I guess we could say. How do I know that? Well, I'm up here yapping my gums, right? It's just happening. And then if we say, what's my calling? We make up a story for what's actually happening. I don't worry about what my calling is. Don't think about it for a second, right? Now, we all know that you're a natural storyteller. So I don't worry much about, is Paolo going to go out and tell a story? Yes or no? It's like, is Paolo going to have his next meal? Yes or no? We kind of know the answer to those questions, don't we? So we could say that your calling is to tell stories and eat food. Funny enough, that's one of mine. That's kind of how I look too. So great. That's our story, but that's because that's what we do. Right. So your call, just keep doing what you're doing. Whenever you feel it, tell it. Whenever you want to connect. Whenever you find yourself separating, find the other story that makes you not separate, and you're set. Don't have to worry about it. And then someday someone will describe you as a great man with wonderful vision with a calling that nobody could believe. And you'll laugh because you'll go, well, I just did what I did. That's your job. Just do what you do. All right. Okay, here's some Dion. Does it help to make a difference by telling your story? The answer to that is yes. So the first thing that you do when you enter into your existence is to learn to tell a story. If you go and when Amir is around, it's really fun because you ask Amir a question and I guarantee you will get a story, right? Because he's still pretty young. He's going to always tell a story, right? And then we learn about graphs and form and all that other stuff is all built on top of telling the story. When you tell your story at the very deepest level, it is an invitation for someone else to stand in that story with you. And if that story is told in a profoundly rooted way, and don't worry about thinking about doing that, let it roll through you, because if it rolls through you, it's going to be told that way. Then somebody will step in there and they will feel like they belong with you in that story. So that makes a difference, doesn't it? Whenever you can create non-separation, a difference is being made and you're magnetizing consciousness because that's where it wants to live, is at the bottom. I call that at the bottom, by the way. So when you hear me use it, just remember, like the elephants, I always see that they're rooted to the bottom. So I always see that people live in their heads. And then when you go to the bottom, you're rooted, right? So when I talk about going to the bottom or to the basement, I'm always talking about, where your source is. That's always where I am on that one. All right. I know I have 62 messages that I have not seen. And I'm hoping that we've covered a bunch today. And I thank you for being with me today. You might have noticed the last few, I haven't been maybe as smooth as I am sometimes. But the difference for me, just so you know, is that I've been writing a lot. And when I write, the fun of writing is I get to wrestle with stuff. I get to think, well, what about this and what about that? And I think that's just the nature of being a storyteller and a writer and a teacher. So I just want to let you know I appreciate you all. Nana knows what I'm talking about, that you guys allow me to come in here and talk about the spiritual path, which is all life is about for me, but at the same time, allow me to kind of fumble around and play with different stories and ideas and just be really vulnerable with everybody. That's human, right? So as brilliant as folks like, say, Winston looks, I can tell you that in the bottom, he's shaking in his boots just like the rest of us. And that's the beauty. The beauty is that that's real. So thank you all for letting me be here. Thank you for being with me while I'm going through all of this. And I love you all, and I will see you all in about 2 weeks. And this will go up probably later today or later tomorrow. So happiness from Hawaii, and I'll see you all soon. Love you. Bye.
Thank you, Abuela. Love you.
Bye, sweets.
Love you too, my friend. Stay real. Stay
Thank
real,
you,
my
Abuela.
friend. Stay real.
Thank you, Abuela.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Abuela.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Nana, say goodbye.
Bye.
Come on, Nana. Thank you.
Wake up, Nana.
End it for us, Nana.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Abuela.
Bye.